What's up guys, Asian here with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Magicka Sorcerer. Specifically, this is going to be a non-pet build with an Inferno Staff backbar. This is the third of our main endgame Magicka Sorcerer builds. This is a Inferno non-pet build, and there are two others, the Lightning Staff backbar non-pet build, and then a pet build. So all three of these can be used pretty much interchangeably. The only thing is with this build is that there is a slight race change because we are going with double Inferno staves, which means that we're going to be using the Dark Elf as our race instead of the Altmer. However, this build does work decently well with the Altmer, so you don't feel like you have to do a race change if you want to use this build. So just like our other build videos, we'll be going over gear, attributes, CP point distribution, skill bars. We'll be talking about our rotation a little bit, talk about skill prioritization, kind of what goes into the rotation, what it looks like, and then we'll finish things off with a 6 million dummy parse. You guys can get an idea of the sustain that we can see, as well as the damage output. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to go ahead and get started first with gear. I am using two-piece Zaan. However, Zaan, while it is very strong, does require you to be within melee range. If you move more than 10 meters away from the enemy, then it won't do as much damage. It'll actually break, and then you lose all the potential from Zaan. The other thing too is that Zaan will only ever affect one enemy, so it kind of loses out when it comes to AoE potential. So if you don't want to use Zaan, if you're going to be playing ranged Magicka, if you're going to be further than 10 meters away from the boss, then obviously you're not going to be using Zaan, you'll be using a different monster helm. So the two monster helms that I would recommend using would be either Ilambris or Skoria. You can choose either one of them. Ilambris will usually do a little bit more DPS than Skoria does, but Skoria is more consistent, especially when you're fighting against a boss that's very mobile. For example, the Twins, or in Maw, or any of the bosses in Asylum. So with mobile bosses, Skoria will pull out a little bit, or at least pretty even with Ilambris, but Ilambris will overall do more DPS against stationary bosses. For our 5-piece, we are going with the Julianos. Julianos is a crafted set, so we do have a heavy chest in order to help improve our resistances a little bit. I do have a health enchant on my chest, and that's just because I am using Witchmother's Potent Brew, so I do need a health enchant in order to get my health up to an appropriate level. So you don't necessarily need to use a heavy chest if you don't want to. It all kind of depends on the RNG factor in terms of which helm weight you get first from either the bosses or the Undaunted chests. So if you happen to get a heavy chest or a heavy shoulder monster helm first, then you can basically craft a light or medium or whatever have you weight of Julianos. The most important thing is we are going with 5 light, 1 heavy, and 1 medium piece, so 5-1-1 setup in order to take advantage of the Undaunted passive to get those additional stats. So that's the most important thing to be aware of. For our jewelry, we're going with 3-piece Moondancer. I have a regen glyph with 2 spell damage glyphs, but you can also go with 3 spell damage glyphs if you'd like. I just like to have the additional regen. Magicka Sorcerers generally have pretty poor regen compared to the other Magicka DPS classes, so that's why we have that regen glyph. However, you can go with 3 spell damage if you so desire. You can replace this set with any of the other Minor Slayer sets, so Infallible, Aether, Moondancer, or Master Architect. If you don't have the Minor Slayer sets, then you can go with 3-piece Willpower instead. Just make sure if you are using Willpower to get the Arcane, the ones that are Arcane and not Robust or Healthy, because you do want that extra Magicka in order to help out your DPS. For our front bar, we're going with the Asylum Perfected Inferno Staff, infused with an Absorbed Magicka enchant. You can use the non-perfect version if you don't have a perfect version, or if you don't have either versions of the Asylum staves, then you can go with one of the Minor Slayer sets, so Moondancer, IA, or Master Architect. It kind of depends on which set piece you manage to get first, and then you use the jewelry to match your Minor Slayer set. However, the Asylum non-perfect and perfected staves are going to pull a little bit higher than your Minor Slayer sets will. If you don't have any of these options, then just a plain old infused Inferno Staff would be fine. For the enchant, I'm using Absorb Magicka enchant, again, mainly to help out with sustain, but you can go with a flame damage enchant if you prefer. It's kind of up to you how you want to deal with that. If you're going with a minor slayer set, then I would recommend probably going with the flame or shock damage enchant, so you get additional procs for burning and concussed respectively. If you're going with an Asylum Staff though, then you can use the Absorb Magicka enchant because the concentrated force set effect will apply burning and concussed for you. And for our back bar, we're going with an infused Maelstrom Inferno Staff with a weapon damage enchant. Now for our race and attribute points, I am a Dark Elf because we are going with a double Inferno Staff build. But like I said earlier in the beginning of the video, you can go with a High Elf, you can go with the Altmer, or any of the magically inclined races, so Bretons or Argonians. Argonians do have a little bit better sustain due to their potion passive, however they do get less max magicka overall, and they don't have any sort of elemental damage boost, so they'll pull the lowest DPS out of your 4 choices. Bretons have a little bit pretty much max magicka. They have 10% max magicka. They also have additional spell resistance, which helps out with your survivability, and they do get some cost reduction to their magicka abilities, which does help out a little bit with sustain, but not quite as much as the Altmer's 9% additional magicka regen. For our Mundus stone, we're going with the Apprentice. You can go with the Lover. The important thing is, if you are going to be using the Lover, to make sure not to go over the penetration cap of 18,200. So when you have all your debuffs up, so that's basically Infused Torag's Crusher, or just a plain Infused Crusher, and Alkosh, if you have your Crusher and Alkosh debuffs up, and then you have the Lover and you're over penetrating, you're basically going over that penetration value by more than, I would say, 300 or 400, then it's going to be a DPS loss, and you're better off going with the Apprentice. So that's going to kind of depend on your group. For example, if you only get Infused Torag's Crusher, then the Lover actually isn't a terrible choice to make, because generally speaking, you will be underneath the penetration cap when Torag's Crusher is out. But if you are going under penetration cap, then Apprentice will win out. We are using Witchmother's Potent Brew, which gives us magicka regen as on top of magicka and max health. You can go with plain blue food. You'll get more health and more magicka that way, but you lose out on regen. There's also a gold food from Clockwork City that you can purchase from guild traders, or you can get the recipe yourself by going through a series of quests on the Outlaw's Refuge. It is a gold recipe, so it does require you to use Perfect Row, so it is fairly expensive to make as well as to buy, so don't feel like you have to use it. It is basically an upgraded version of Witchmother, so it does give you slightly more health magicka and magicka regen, as well as give you a health regen on top of that. But again, it is expensive, so don't feel like you have to use it. You can just use Witchmothers, and that's perfectly fine. Now for our skill bars. For our front bar, we have Crystal Frags, Crushing Shock. You can go with the other morph, Force Pulse, if you'd like. I personally like Crushing Shock, and I use it on all of my ranged magicka DPS classes, mainly for that interrupt. The interrupt is going to be pretty important in a lot of different trials, so it's important to have at least one of your magicka DPS having Crushing Shock. Bound Aegis, Haunting Curse, Inner Light, and Shooting Star. For our back bar, we have Mage's Wrath, Liquid Lightning, Bound Aegis again, Blockade of Fire. I have Elemental Drain here, but this is where you would put your shield. Oops, wrong line. Hardened Ward or Empowered Ward, whichever one you decide to use. Hardened Ward will give you a larger shield, and so more survivability. Empowered Ward will give you more magicka regen by giving you minor intellect, plus it lasts for a longer period of time. However, the shield is generally smaller. So those are your two options there. It doesn't really matter which morph you pick. I like Hardened Ward overall. I do want to make a special note of Harness Magicka. Some builds that you see will recommend you that you use Harness Magicka. So you can use Harness Magicka if you would like to. Generally speaking, Ward is give you a larger shield, which helps improve your survivability more. And in my opinion, being able to stay alive is more important than having better sustain. Harness Magicka does return some magic when you get hit by spell damage, but that's kind of the downside. You need to actually get hit by spell damage in order to get the effect. So I personally prefer to stick with Ward, but Harness Magicka can be used. I just don't think it is worth it when you have a much larger shield available to you. That's also cheaper too. So Harness Magicka, you can see here, costs 3,900, and your shield here costs almost 1,000 Magicka less, so it's a little bit better on the sustain that way. And our ultimate is going to be Fiery Rage. Now for our CP points, we have 240 points to spread across the 3 different nodes, however you'd like. Under the green CPs, you have 75 in Arcanus and 75 in Tenacity. You can kind of play around with the other 90 points that you have remaining. You can put them wherever you'd like, kind of make up your 4 weaknesses here and there. I have 31 to Shadow Word, 20 into Tumbling, and 31 to Warlord, but again, you can kind of play around with the other passives if you'd like. For our blue CPs, one thing to take note of is that this particular setup is optimized for my raid group, where we only get a Torag's Infused Crusher, so that's why I have so many points into Spell Erosion. So depending on your group, if you are using Alkash, then you won't necessarily need to put as many points into Spell Erosion. Generally speaking, Magicka DPS will need to put at least a couple of points into Spell Erosion, no matter, even if you have 100% uptime on Alkash, you just don't have as much penetration debuff sets as Stamina does, so you will need to put a couple points into Spell Erosion. So what I recommend doing is picking up the Constellations add-on here, and then just Comet Metrics as well. You're going to need to get Comet Metrics in order for this to work. And what you basically do is you take your parse. So for example, let's say you're doing Valarial, which is a pretty accurate parse, or something like Storm Atronach on Aether and Archon. It's a pretty good measure for your DPS. You basically import it. You do have to manually put in your spell penetration. Everything else will be filled in for you. Then you can hop over to this champion points panel and you hit calculate, and on this column here it'll tell you what your optimized CP points is for your particular raid group. So I highly recommend picking up Constellations in order to figure out what your optimal setup is. For me, I have 52 into Elfborn, 49 into Elemental Expert, 39 into Spell Erosion, 16 into Staff Expert, 56 into Master at Arms, and 28 into Thaumaturge. And finally, for our red CPs, I prefer to go with a one-size-fits-most situations, but you can play around a little bit and kind of redistribute it accordingly depending on the content that you are running. For example, if you're running VMAW, you will be taking more magic damage compared to physical damage, so you're not actually going to need that many points into Hardy as a DPS, so you can pick those out and put them into Elemental Defender and Spell Shield or Ironclad. I have 48 into Ironclad, 48 into Thick Skinned, 1 into Light Armor Focus, 56 into both Hardy and Elemental Defender, and 31 into Bastion. You can take points out of Bastion and put them elsewhere if you'd like, but I like to put 31 points here, not just for the damage shield boost, but also for these 2 passives here. Field Physician, which reduces the damage you take while you're rezzing somebody, which is always helpful to have, and Infusion. So when you resurrect somebody, you increase their Magicka regen by a healthy amount. So that's really helpful for when you res out your Magicka DPS, your tanks, your healers, because they all use Magicka, and getting that Magicka back faster will really help them out after you get the res off. So now with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about our rotations. Let's head over to the 3 million dummy here so I can explain things to you. So the 2 dots on your back bar, Liquid Lightning and Blockade of Store, or in this case Blockade of Fire, are going to be your strongest and highest contributors right after your light attacks. So because Liquid Lightning has a 10-second duration and Blockade has an 8-second duration, on your back bar you always want to do Liquid Lightning first, and then Blockade. So if you take a look at the Strendar, let's put up in darker. If you take a look at Strendar right here, you can see that when we do Liquid Lightning and Blockade, they both run out at about the same time. So that's kind of what we want to do. If you do Blockade and then Liquid Lightning like that, you can see here that Blockade is going to run out before Liquid Lightning does, so when you have to reapply your dots, you will end up overcasting Liquid Lightning as a result, which ends up being a Magicka loss, Magicka drain, as well as a DPS loss as well. And then on your front bar, Haunting Curse has a 12-second duration, so it doesn't line up quite very well with your other dots. It has one damage burst at 3.5 seconds and then another burst at 8.5 seconds, so you can think of it as a 12-second dot. So it doesn't fall very well, so a Magicka Sorcerer pretty much has a fairly dynamic rotation overall. So generally what you want to do is you obviously want to pot up first, buff and everything like that, and then go ahead and start off with Liquid Lightning, Blockade. And then you want to make sure to get your Crystal Frag procs out as soon as you can, and then just start weaving your Force Pulse. Or in my case, Crushing Shock. As soon as you get a Crystal Frag proc out, you're going to want to use it, and once Haunting Curse expires, make sure to recast Haunting Curse. So don't want to do it too early, so you want to wait for that second explosion to go off before you recast it. But beyond that, that's pretty much the entire rotation there. So you don't have that many dots to keep track of. You only have 3, so that's Liquid Lightning, Blockade, and Haunting Curse. Then you just basically want to use your spammable in between monitoring your dots. Again, you want to make sure to get your Crystal Frag procs off as quickly as you can so you make room for another proc to happen, because if you do get another proc while you have a proc already activated, then you pretty much wasted that proc. So you want to make sure to get that off immediately. So in a rotation, you'll sometimes, it varies depending on who you ask. I personally try to maintain my dots as best I can, but I do know a couple of sorcs who prioritize the Crystal Frag proc. So for example, if I was doing my rotation here, let's see if I can get a frag proc. So let's say I got a frag proc as I'm supposed to swap over. I like to maintain my buffs dots, but some people will actually use the Crystal Frag procs before they go to their back bar, and basically sacrifice a little bit of uptime on their dots in order to get that Crystal Frag proc off. So that's kind of up to you how you want to play it. There is no right or wrong answer there. So let's go ahead and do our 6 million dummy parse so you guys can get an idea of the damage you can pull, as well as the sustain and the overall rotation, what it looks like. So you will need to heavy attack on this build. Sorcs just have really bad sustain compared to some other Magicka DPS classes. So you will need to heavy attack. I heavy attack basically once every other blockade, so every 2 blockade casts I will heavy attack once. You can do 3 heavy attacks in 1 blockade duration, so you can go with that route if you'd like, but that's kind of up to you. So you will need to heavy attack, so try to plan them out. Like I said, I do 1 heavy attack every other blockade, and then it's enough for a 6 million dummy parse, but for the longer fights it's not quite as good. So sometimes I'll just stay on my back bar, do my 3 heavy attacks, and then continue on with my rotation by just reapplying my dots. So let's go ahead and get started with this parse here. I will try to narrate throughout the parse, try to point out key information here and there, but I might not be able to get everything. So starting off, I do actually wait to the 3rd blockade to start heavy attacking. And then from here on out, I do 1 heavy attack every other blockade cast. So that's 1. It's 2, and then this is where I heavy attack. So in terms of ultimate, you kind of have 2 choices here. You can go with the Destro ultimate or Shooting Star. Shooting Star does a little bit more single target DPS, so definitely use that if you are going for a boss without any adds. But if you do need that extra cleave, then go with the Destro Staff ulti. They pull pretty similar DPS, so it's pretty much a personal preference thing, even with bosses without adds. But with adds, definitely try to go with the Destro Staff ulti, because that has a much larger range than Shooting Star does. Go ahead and heavy attack here. So you can kind of already see how bad sustain is, even with a regen glyph and an absorb magicka enchant. Heavy attack here. See, we're starting to run out of magicka. So now we're going to execute. So I could have started to execute a little bit earlier if I wanted to, but I decided not to. So we are running out of Magicka here, so I will do 3 heavy attacks here to get Magicka back up and then reapply my dots. So because I did my 3 heavy attacks, I actually won't do the heavy attack. So that counts as my every other. My execute's really sloppy because I was pretty late on that. Pretty late on the shooting star. So that's Mag Sorc. So you can see here we pulled about 32.9k, almost 33k with a Inferno Staff back bar. So you can see here Liquid Lightning and Blockade, like I said, are going to be 2 top contributors right below light attacks here. Crystal Frags, you can see, does a lot of damage here. Crits for about 30k, so that's kind of why you want to try to make sure to get your Crystal Frag procs, as many as you can. So you want to use your Crystal Frag procs right when you have it, so you can get another one. And then you can see Zaan does a decent amount of damage, about 2k DPS here. But again, if you are not within melee range, then you can't really use Zaan, so in that case you would be using Ilambris or Skoria. And then everything else goes ahead down the line. So if we take a look at our regen versus drain per second, we can see that we have about 100 disparity, which is pretty small, but that's with a regen glyph plus an absorb Magicka glyph, plus with plenty of heavy attacks as well. So double Inferno Staff definitely takes a hit with sustain compared to the Lightning Staff back bar. This is a dummy parse, so do keep in mind that when you compare a Magicka Sorc parse with an Inferno back bar and a Lightning Staff back bar on a dummy, the Lightning Staff is going to have better sustain because they have an innate source of off balance, and off balance does, when you have you attack the enemy that is off balance, you do gain more resources, so there is that aspect to it as well. So if we did have off balance going on during this parse, then our sustain probably wouldn't be as bad and wouldn't have to heavy attack quite as often. So that's something you want to keep in mind. So that's it for this video. I hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.